Rudrayatte dakshinam mukham Tena mam pahi nityam, tena mam pahi nityam. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourselves, O Lord, and protect us evermore from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. Om Vishnur va Tripurantako bhavatu va Brahma Surendrota va Bhanur va Shashalakshanota Bhagavan Buddhota Siddhota va Raga dvesha visharti moha rahita sattvanukampodhyato yasarvai saha samskrito gunaganais tasmai namah sarvada. The Supreme Reality and its messengers are known by various names in various traditions. But as for me, I offer my worship always to the one going by any name and belonging to any tradition, who is free from attachment and hatred, who is free from worldliness and delusion, who is possessed of all noble virtues, and who has compassion for all living beings. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all. Good morning. I've been thinking that one Sunday a month that I would like to do a question and answer session. But I'm not going to put you on the spot this time because I came up with a question of my own. And next month there's only one lecture, and so from me, that is, because I'll be gone to Costa Rica only for 2 weeks plus 1 day. But it happens I'm going on a Sunday and coming back on a Sunday, and the middle Sunday is gone also. So though I'll only be gone less than half of the month, 15 days out of 31. There'll only be one Sunday that I will be here for the lecture. So next month also I will not give a question and answer session, but starting in April, I thought that the last Sunday each month I would do question and answer session. So today I came up with my own. And actually I shouldn't take credit for it, because on this past December, when I'd just flown from the US, from India to the US, to Los Angeles, and I spoke in LA twice on the day after I arrived, and then I went to Santa Barbara and spoke, and then I went to Trabuco and spoke. And in Trabuco, Swami Yogeshananda, a very senior Swami, about 94 years old, he asked that question when I was at Trabuco. We had a informal satsang, which was all question and answer. And so he asked me that question, and it was a very good question. So I spoke on it some there, but I thought that I would speak on this question again here, when prayers go unanswered. So Swami Yogeshananda's question was, what do we do when prayers go unanswered? How do we handle it? How do we manage when our prayers go unanswered? It was a very good question, and I knew he was not asking for himself. He was asking for others. And I don't know if there was a particular person in the audience he was thinking about, or whether he just wanted to see what I would say on the matter. But anyway, it was a very good question, and one that usually you don't hear our Swamis talking about. So I thought, well, let me start with that question. And if I run out of steam, then I'll ask you for more questions today. We'll see how far this question takes me. And I intentionally did not prepare anything to say. I prepared only the question, but nothing to answer, because otherwise it wouldn't be a question and answer session. So though the question was asked 2 months ago, you're getting the answer now as a spontaneous answer. Though there also I gave some answer to the question then, but I'll develop it here also in a different way. So the question, of course, the difficulty is very real for many of us. Anyone who approaches God in prayer, in meditation, through japa, etc., there's always the question, does God really care? Is God really hearing? And many people have lost faith over that very question. When I was a student in my last year of high school, I was an exchange student living in Sweden, in a suburb of Stockholm. In fact, that's where I found out about Vedanta for the first time, when I was 17 in Sweden. There was a girl in the same school that I was in, the same grade of school, though not in any of my classes. But she was a friend of a mutual friend of mine, and this friend introduced her to me and said that this girl, Maria, she has lost her faith, and her whole family lost their faith, because she had a young brother who, when he was only 3 years old, he came down with a sickness. It was probably cancer, but I don't remember now, but came down with something, a serious ailment. And the whole family prayed and prayed and prayed over the child, asking God to spare the life of the child, and the child died anyway. And so the family said that the parents said our child was just an innocent child and never hurt anyone, a very good child, too young to have done anything wrong. So why did my child deserve this? We prayed to God. If God is God, if God is all-powerful, if God is omnipotent, then why did God allow our child to die? And if there is a God and He heard our prayers, then He's heartless. And otherwise there is no God. So they became convinced atheists because of the fact that God had not answered their sincere prayers, their earnest and very desperate prayers also. And so that's an extreme example, but it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon. That sort of thing happens where we pray for a loved one or pray for ourselves in desperate circumstances, and we feel that help doesn't come. We feel that we're abandoned. We feel that in spite of our prayers, in spite of what seems to us a justified plea, we're not asking for anything bad. We're not asking for anything material even. We're not asking for I want a new fancy car. I don't have money to pay for it, but I want a fancy new car, so why don't you give it to me? No, not something like that. Or I want a nicer house. That also I don't have any money to pay for it and don't have credit, but still I think you should give me a house. If you were God, you could give me a new house. So why don't you give me a house? No, nothing like that. You're praying for the life of a dear one, someone who is very dear to you. And again, in the case of this child, in the case of any child, someone who is innocent, someone who doesn't, in our view, doesn't deserve to die. So the question comes, of course, again, the question of this family. Is there a God? If there's no God, then of course that explains it. You're just praying to the wall, turning and talking to the wall and asking it to save your child, and of course the wall can't do anything. So if there is no God, your prayers are as good as talking to the wall. And if there is a God, then where was He? Where was He? Why didn't He answer our sincere prayers? So that's the problem, when sincere prayers go unanswered. And sometimes it's a much more minor case than that. Maybe sometimes it's just we pray and pray for spiritual understanding, for spiritual advancement, for the experience of God and so forth, and there also we seem to get nowhere. We pray and pray, and yet we seem to be in the same place. And so where is God? Where is God when we pray, when we do japa for years and years and years, and we seem to be the same people? So the question is that doesn't need to be framed in such extreme terms of parents praying for their sick small child. It applies across the board when there's something that we're praying earnestly, praying for a long time, and it seems to be an innocent and a good prayer, and is, by any ordinary standard, an innocent and a good prayer. So, well, where is God, or is God? To understand the question of whether God hears our prayers or not, we have to understand the nature of God and the nature of our relationship to God. We can't just, well, let me rephrase that and say that when we are in desperate straits, that's not a time when we can expect to deepen our understanding because we're desperate. If we have a child who's ill and we're praying for the child, that's not a time for philosophical reasoning. It's not a time for sitting back and thinking, oh, what is the nature of God? And what is the nature of my relationship to God? And so therefore it's important at other times. Spiritual life is for every day, not for times of desperation. Prayer is for every day, not for times of desperation. Because at that time, all we see is our need and the intense longing that the heart has for the removal of that need, for the fulfillment of that need, rather. And so in spiritual life, it's always important to know that practice comes at times when we're not in distress. If we practice at times when we're not in distress, then we have the strength to sustain moments of distress or long periods of distress. If we don't, we won't have that strength. And so the time to understand the nature of prayer and why it seems that God doesn't answer our prayers is at times like this, when we're not in the midst of distress. So first of all, is there a God who hears our prayer? We find in the modern world, Sri Ramakrishna, perhaps more than any of the great teachers of the modern world, and there have been a number of great teachers in the modern world over the last 3 centuries, a number of great spiritual people in India itself. So many great spiritual people have come over the last 3 centuries. And yet of all of them, you find that Sri Ramakrishna emphasized prayer more than any. If you read the Kathamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, you find over and over again, he says, pray to God with a yearning heart. Pray to God with a yearning heart. So he emphasizes the need for prayer and the benefit of prayer. He says, learn to talk to God. Learn to talk to God. So he at least recommends prayer. And so there must be, if you think of Sri Ramakrishna as a great soul who knew something about spiritual life, there must be a reason why he recommended prayer. Sri Ramakrishna also said that God hears the sincere prayer of a devotee. Of course, that brings up the question, well, does God not hear the prayer of others, those who are not devotees? Is God partial only to devotees? So that's another question. Does he only hear those who are... It's like if a family member of ours asks for some money, then we may give them money. But if somebody on the street comes up to us and asks us for money, then we don't want to give it to them, because my family people are my own and people on the street are not my own. That's the ordinary standpoint, the general standpoint of people. And so is God like that? Is he as biased and as partial as we are, that he only gives to his devotees? Well, no, but that I will explain in a little bit, that it's not a question of partiality, that God hears the longing prayers of his devotee. But of course the simple explanation of that is that it's only a sincere devotee that prays earnestly to God. So that's why God hears the prayers of a devotee, because the devotee is the one who prays earnestly. So it's not really partiality, it's a question that the devotee prays. But then the question comes, of course, that if God is omniscient, doesn't God know what I need already? Why do I have to tell God that I need something? Why do I have to tell God? If God is all-knowing, and if God isn't all-knowing, God isn't God, then why should I have to inform him of things? Is he forgetful? Does he have post-it notes, and when I pray he makes a little post-it note, remember that so-and-so asked me for such and such? No, that of course we can't think that of God. So again, the question comes, why should we pray? And then, does God hear prayers? Well, Sri Ramakrishna said in answer to the question, does God hear prayers? He said that God hears even the footfall of an ant. God hears even the footfall of an ant. Will he not, Sri Ramakrishna goes on, will he not hear the prayer of a devotee? Will he not hear the prayer of a devotee? If he hears even the footfall of an ant. The ant's footfall is not asking for anything. It's not asking for God's attention, saying, "Oh Lord, here I am." No, it's just the footfall of an ant. And yet God hears that. So will he not hear the prayer of a devotee? So Sri Ramakrishna assures us that God does hear. But then the question again comes, well, why doesn't he answer? Why does he seem not to answer? So let me stop for a moment here and say a word about the nature of God. As you know, in Vedanta, each one of us is one with God. But one with God in what sense? Not in the sense that each of us is one with Ishvara, with God, the Divine Mother, Vishnu, Shiva, the Trinity of Christianity, or Allah of Islam, etc. Not one with the God who's the ruler of the universe. We're one with Brahman, which is beyond even that. Our nature is the same as the ultimate reality. Ishvara, God, the personal God, the God to whom we pray, the God to whom we worship, is also one with Brahman. And so in that sense we say we are one with God, because we're one with Brahman. That is the ultimate reality. If I can go to and each of us can, through long, persistent discipline, if I can go to the very depths of my being, I find that I disappear and only reality is. Only reality is. There's no I, no you, no God, no man, nothing but reality. And there I am that reality. But when I come back to this universe, I find that there's this individual, and then there's Ishvara, God, whom the Muslims call Allah, whom Christians call God, whom Hindus call by many, many names, both generic names like Ishvara, Prabhu, Nath, etc., or by specific names like Shiva, Kali, Durga, Krishna, etc., or Ramakrishna. So when we say we're one with God, we don't mean we're one with Ishvara as Ishvara. We're one with the reality behind Ishvara, the infinite without end. But Ishvara is as Swami Vivekananda says, Ishvara, one definition of Ishvara, of God, in this personal sense, the God whom we pray to, God is the sum total of all souls, not just human souls, but everywhere there's consciousness, God is the sum total of all of that. God is what's called in the Hindu tradition the Antaryami. If you try to straighten out all of the names for God in the Hindu tradition, you'll go crazy because there are too many. You'll burst a brain cell or something. So the Antaryami, the inner controller, but the inner controller within everyone. So what it means when we say that God is the sum total of the consciousness of all beings is that God is that infinite consciousness, Brahman, identified with the consciousness of all beings in totality. I, or you, say I for convenience of speaking's sake, but the same for every person, I am that person who is identified with one body and mind, that infinite consciousness, Brahman, identified with a single body and mind. So I operate through this body and mind. But God is that infinite consciousness identified with the sum total of all consciousnesses. And so God hears the footfall of an ant, not because the ant is walking and God puts his ear like that and listens to the ant walking, no, but because God is within the ant. God hears the movement of everything in the universe. So God is that infinite consciousness identified with everything, which hears everything, which sees everything, which knows everything. I see this little bit. I can't even see what's behind me. I can't see what's going on inside of this body. I can't see my digestion. I can't see my lungs operating and so forth. I have some awareness of it because of external manifestations, but I can't see it. I see an extremely limited part of the world and know an extremely limited part of experience. But God is that infinite consciousness identified with everything, and so sees and hears everything. That's why accepting for a moment prayer, forgetting the question and accepting for the moment that prayer is true, that's why I can pray here. At the same moment, you can be praying in your homes. People in the Middle East can be praying. People in South America can be praying. People in Africa can be praying. People in India can be praying. And yet, God hears all of it. God hears all of it without getting confused. Now, who said what? What was it that so-and-so said? Or was it so-and-so who said that? Or was it so-and-so who said that? No, without any of that. God is that consciousness which knows everything, which hears everything, the witness of everything. Whereas we are the witnesses of just a little tiny bit of experience. If we go back to the depths of our being, we find that infinite reality. And that also is the infinite reality of God. There is no God, there is no man, there's no animal, there's no earth, no worlds, no time, no space. They're just a reality, just the silent, infinite depths of blissful reality. And that we are one with, but not with God. So now, God again hears prayer, and hears the prayer of many different people, because again, God, he or she, let me say she, because not to give preference of one over the other, but because he is used so often that it's nice to hear she once in a while. So she, the Divine Mother, she is the witness of everything, everywhere that's happening at every moment, at all times, throughout time. And so she hears the prayers of everyone. So then again, why is it that prayer is not answered? Why is it that prayer seems not to be answered? So first of all, Sri Ramakrishna said, learn to pray. And then he said that prayer certainly works, that God hears the sincere prayer of a devotee. And he also said, once in the Kotamrita, it's recorded in 1884, he's talking with M, and he says that Sri Ramakrishna says that everyone can realize the self through prayer. And then M says, yes, sir, but some according to karma will get it now, and some maybe after many lifetimes. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, no, not that. I mean everyone without exception now can realize the self through sincere prayer. Can realize the self, the Atman, the ultimate truth, through sincere prayer. He says everyone can realize it through sincere prayer. And so he advises prayer over and over and over again. So again, why does prayer sometimes not seem to work? Why does prayer, and sometimes for years we may pray over something, and again, coming to something that we advise people to pray over, like praying for spiritual understanding, praying for spiritual growth, praying for the vision of the divine, and yet it doesn't seem to come. One thing is that we have to understand what the nature of prayer is. Again, if God is God, God knows everything already, so we don't need to inform God of anything. Then why do we need to pray? We need to pray for our sake. We need to pray for our sake, because the problem in spiritual life, and therefore the problem in ordinary life, is forgetfulness. Because spiritual life is really ordinary life. According to Vedanta, everyone in the universe is leading a spiritual life. There's no other life to lead, no other life that can be led. Everyone is leading a spiritual life already. Only those that we call spiritual aspirants or devotees are those who are doing it consciously. Everybody else is stumbling around in the dark and don't yet know what they're doing or why. They think that, well, I'm here to enjoy life, I'm here to have a good time. Or they don't even think about why they're here. They're just born and they find themselves here and they just lead an ordinary life, trying to spend most of it in self-forgetfulness because life is too painful. That type of life is too painful, so we just try to forget ourselves in entertainment and trying to have a good time. So that's the way most people spend their lives. But everyone is actually leading a spiritual life. Why? Because everyone wants to be happy. Everyone wants to exist. Everyone wants to be. That's why we go to the doctor. That's why we try to cure ourselves when we're sick. That's why we try to extend our lives. Everyone wants to exist. Everyone wants to be happy. And everyone wants to know. That is, everyone wants to understand. You may say that, well, no, a lot of people don't want to know. That's why they drop out of school. No, people don't drop out of school because they don't want to know. It's because they don't want to go to the trouble to learn. It's not because they don't want to know. Everybody wants to know. And so everybody wants to know, everyone wants to be, and everyone wants to be happy. And that's the nature of reality. And so everyone is seeking to be, everyone is seeking to know, and everyone to understand, and everyone is seeking to be happy. And that eventually we find is only found in one place, and that's in God, or in the self. If we follow the impersonal path, the path of Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta, then I seek to know myself, because all happiness is within me. Existence itself is my very nature. Knowledge is my very nature. I don't have to look outside of myself. Or if I'm God-oriented, then I look for it through union with God. Look for it in God, and that fulfills me by uniting myself with God. Then I join myself to God, who's the source of all blessedness. And so everyone is leading a spiritual life whether they know it or not, because they're seeking ultimate reality, which is existence, consciousness, bliss. Everyone is seeking what reality is, but they don't know where to seek it. And so a spiritual aspirant is one who has begun to find where to seek it. But when we begin to seek it, we find that there seem to be so many obstacles in the way. No, there are not so many obstacles in the way. We eventually find that there's only one obstacle in the way of our spiritual advancement. Only one obstacle, and that obstacle is ourselves, our own mind. Swami Sarvagatanandaji, a great Swami who for many years was the head of the center in Boston and in Providence, he used to say that spiritual life is really psychological life. But spiritually we're perfect already. Spiritually we don't have there's no such thing as a spiritual problem, because spiritually we're perfect. We're the infinite reality already. We don't have a spiritual problem. We have psychological problems. Physical problems, those are, we take care of those with the help of doctors and exercise and diet and things like that. We muddle through trying to keep the body operating enough so that it doesn't bother us. But spiritual life really is psychological life, because that's where all of our problems are. And so our problems are problems of the mind. And so that's where all of our spiritual work is. And the basic problem, whether you follow the path of devotion or the path of knowledge, the basic problem is forgetfulness. If you follow the path of devotion, the problem is forgetfulness of God. If you follow the path of knowledge, the problem is forgetfulness of who I am. But the problem is forgetfulness in either case. And so prayer, what does prayer do? Prayer is like drilling a hole through the cloud of ignorance. Drilling a hole through the cloud of ignorance. Prayer, every time that we pray, we're trying to pierce through the cloud of ignorance and come to God. I've mentioned 2 or 3 times in the short time that I've been here in Houston, this vision of the Holy Mother, but it's apt here also. It keeps showing up because it keeps being appropriate to the topic. The vision of Holy Mother when she was seated with 3 or 4 of her women devotees around her, and she went into a state of deep samadhi. Those around her, Golap Ma, Yogin Ma, said that she was completely forgetful of the world, completely oblivious of the body. They were trained, they had seen Sri Ramakrishna, so they knew the signs of high ecstasy, and knew that if one of us saw Holy Mother in that state, we just realized that she seemed to be out of it, but we wouldn't know anything more. But they were trained by seeing Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother on a daily basis. They knew the outer signs of these high states of consciousness. So it said that she was in an extraordinarily high state of consciousness for a long time. And then gradually some consciousness began to come back to her. Outer consciousness began to come back. But she wasn't yet at a plane where she knew that people were seated around her. She wasn't yet to a plane where she could be aware of the actual social situation around her. Her mind was still too high. But it was beginning to come back, enough so that she had some control over the body and could speak. And so she spoke as if she were speaking to herself, not conscious that there were others listening. And she said that no one knows how Sri Ramakrishna suffers. And she was speaking of Sri Ramakrishna as God, as Ishvara, the God in the sense of the Christian God, the Islamic Allah, etc. God in that sense. Said that no one knows how Sri Ramakrishna suffers. Seated in the hearts of all, he only wants people to turn their attention towards him, and yet how few do. How few do. Now again, Sri Ramakrishna, as I explained the other day, for those of you who heard it already, this explanation, it's not that Sri Ramakrishna needs our attention. No, it's not that God needs our attention. God is infinite fulfillment itself. But God is also of the nature of love. And so God, we are all images of God. We are all images of God. We're all reflections of God. So God is of the nature of love. And so God seated within the hearts of each one of us. She only waits in order for us to turn our attention. And then there's the recognition of our identity with God. And so it's out of love that God is seated in the hearts of all, waiting for us to turn our attention. So then, of course, the question comes, well, if God is God, why doesn't she just turn our attention towards her? Well, then, of course, there are various answers for that. One answer that Sri Ramakrishna and the Holy Mother used to give is that this is the Divine Mother's play. That this is the Divine Mother's play. And this is the way that the play goes on. The Vedantic answer is that we have all fallen into forgetfulness. We've all fallen into forgetfulness, and we have to come out of that forgetfulness. Doesn't God care? Well, that's why God incarnates again and again in order to remind us. But it takes work on our part. You see, even with the great disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, who in his lifetime they had very high experiences through his blessing. And yet after Sri Ramakrishna passed away, they themselves had to spend years of spiritual practice. As Swami Brahmananda said when he was asked, why is it Sri Ramakrishna gave you everything? Why is it that you perform such severe austerities? He said, yes, Sri Ramakrishna gave us everything, but we have to make it our own. That's why Holy Mother said that to those that she'd given initiation, she said that that which you have received, that will assure your liberation. But if you want to experience it soon, then you have to work. That sooner or later it will work. It's magic. It's not magic, it's a spiritual principle. But we could say it appears to us as magic, or it appears as God's grace. But when that begins to work, what will we find? The sign that it's working is suddenly the person begins to think, no, I want to think of God. I want to pray to God. I want to meditate on God. Then they begin their spiritual life and their spiritual practice. That's how God's grace manifests. And so we still come back to the fact that we're suffering from ignorance, and that we have to come out of that ignorance. And we come out of it by repeatedly trying to remember, through prayer, through japa, through meditation, through self-awareness if we're on the path of knowledge. We continually come back to that same remembrance. Someone once said to Sri Ramakrishna, sir, meditation is very difficult. And Sri Ramakrishna said, yes, meditation is very difficult. But it's enough just to think of God. It's enough to think of God. What does that mean? That means remember God. If you think of God, you're remembering God. And so prayer is one of the great tools for drilling through the hole in ignorance. By praying to God, we're focusing our mind on the divine itself. Focusing our mind, and thereby we're drilling through the cloud of ignorance that surrounds us. Unless that cloud of ignorance is removed, then there's no salvation, no final liberation. And so sooner or later, through our own efforts or through the grace of God, which eventually come to the same thing, those who have realized the highest say it was only by grace. Even great jnanis like Ramana Maharshi. Even the Katha Upanishad talks about the grace of the self. That is how we begin to turn our mind towards the ultimate. And so again, one of the ways to do that is through sincere prayer, because prayer is a way of focusing the mind. When we tell the mind to meditate, say we're going to meditate on the luminous form, just a luminous cloud of luminosity within the heart. We're going to meditate on a visualization. We're going to picture light within the heart. That's a traditional meditation. Or say, to make it a little more tangible, we picture a lotus within the heart, and in the lotus there's an effulgent light, which is we think of as the divine. And so we try to picture that. Okay, now don't think of anything else, just picture that lotus and the light within the heart. Well, after a few moments, we find the mind is thinking about something else. We suddenly think, oh my goodness, I've got to pick up light bulbs. That's right. The light went out in the bathroom, and tonight it's going to be a problem, and so I've got to go to the market. When I'm at the market, then also I needed something else. What was that else? The other thing I needed? And then pretty soon we're a million miles away from meditation. And so meditation is like that. It works, but it works by continually bringing the mind back. But it's hard work, and it takes years and years of practice. Prayer has the advantage of you're not telling the mind, okay, don't think of anything, just picture this one thing that you may not really be that interested in, but just picture this one thing and don't think about anything else. No. You're directing the stream of the mind towards the divine. The mind always wants to talk. If you don't have a person to talk to, you talk to yourself internally. The mind goes on chattering. And so prayer directs that mental chatter towards the divine object. And not by talking to God about all sorts of what I did today and what's happening in the newspaper and all of that. No. But you take the stream of the mind, that desire for self-expression, and you turn it towards God. And in prayer, you begin by talking to God, praying in words and so forth. But eventually you find that your prayer simplifies to just a few things. You realize that there's not much that I want. I just want your protection. I want your guidance. I want your presence. I want to feel your presence. So it becomes very concentrated to just a few needs that you go on asking for the same thing. That's a great thing in prayer, is that it teaches you how to sustain a single thought. How to sustain a single thought. That's the biggest drawback in modern life. The biggest single problem in modern life. There are many problems. There's climate change. There's so many other problems in modern life. But the biggest problem in modern life, out of which everything else, which aggravates every other problem, is the inability to focus the mind, the inability to sustain a train of thought. So many people I meet nowadays, young people, they say, oh, I never read a book. If I need information, I just Google it and get a little bit of information. Well, no, that's losing the ability to follow a sustained train of thought. One of the great things about reading a book is that the book puts the mind in one place and leaves it there for a sustained amount of time. And so prayer does the same thing, but not by focusing on a book, but by focusing on the divine being. And so prayer is a wonderful way of training the mind to focus and to sustain a level of thought. In the beginning you find that you have to talk to God about things, and you have to put words to your desires and so forth, your spiritual desires, your spiritual longing. But in time you find you don't even have to put words to it, that it's just the stream of your consciousness flowing towards God. That itself becomes your prayer. And when you come to that point, then you begin to feel the definite presence of God. One of the other benefits of prayer is that when you pray, you quickly begin to feel that someone is listening to your prayer. Otherwise, you can't sustain it. That's why Sri Ramakrishna tells people, if you don't believe in God, then just pray, oh Lord, do you exist? That sounds very strange. If you don't believe in God, why are you going to pray? But he said that because he knows that if you can sustain that for a while, the belief begins to come that someone is listening. Someone is listening. And so then that gives you encouragement to go on asking. The fulfillment of that prayer comes after a long time. And again, why doesn't God fulfill that prayer immediately? It's because we have surrounded ourselves with age-long ignorance and forgetfulness. And the fact is also, that's very important in why God doesn't answer our prayers, is that we don't really want God. We think we want God, but we're all like Swami Brahmananda when he was Rakal, a young boy coming to Sri Ramakrishna, or a young man in his teens coming to Sri Ramakrishna. He begged Sri Ramakrishna for ecstasy. He begged him, please give me ecstasy. And so finally Sri Ramakrishna asked the Divine Mother to give him ecstasy, so Rakal went and sat in the Nat Mandir, outside the Kali temple, and began to meditate, and suddenly he saw a divine light. And he jumped up so frightened that he ran away. And Sri Ramakrishna said, you rascal, you've been praying, bothering me so much for ecstasy, and you get a little bit of vision of light and you run away. That's because the same thing would happen to most of us. And so, part of the reason why our prayers are not answered is that we don't really want God, because we haven't yet come to the point where we realize that that's the only thing that we really want. We want so many things in life, but eventually find that no, I was mistaking the object of my want. The only thing that I really want, because it's the only place I'm really going to find what I'm looking for, is God. And then our prayer begins to become intense, and then we begin to drill through the cloud of ignorance and find our way to the divine object, who is not an object at all, but the subject of all subjects, the eye of all eyes. In the Jewish part of the Bible, what they call the Torah and Christians call the Old Testament, God tells Moses, I am that I am. I am that I am. Ramana Maharshi used to say that was one of the two greatest statements in the Bible. I am that I am. The other is, be still, that he also told to Moses, I think. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. But the first one was, I am that I am. I am the I am. I am the I am. I say I am. That's God speaking. I don't mean Swami Atmarupananda is God and you're not. No, the I am speaking within each one of us. The I am speaking within the mouse. A mouse has self-consciousness. A mouse has self-consciousness. A worm has self-consciousness. That's why a worm tries to avoid danger, because it's aware of itself. It has self-consciousness. It has the sense I am, not the words, because most worms don't speak English, but don't have the words I am. It has the experience I am. And that I am is the I am of God. And that's why we're one with God. And so that which I seek is the divine object, but that divine object is the divine subject. It's the I am. It's, as it says in the Quran, that God is closer to me than my jugular vein. And Vedanta would say yes, that God is closer to me even than my ego. Closer to me even than my ego. God is more me even than my ego. Even the ego can be externalized, but God can't be externalized, because God is the center of my being. And so through prayer, I pray to the divine object, or through the path of knowledge, I try to identify with the subject, but either way, I come to the divine subject. That which I really am, and that which everything really is. And so I don't come to the point where I hear the footfall of every ant in the universe, because then that's still within this world. But I do realize that which is behind even that, higher even than that, the infinite consciousness that I come to. So prayer is a wonderful tool for drilling through the cloud of ignorance and coming to that which is beyond all ignorance. So why do our prayers go unanswered sometimes? One answer is that it's because of our own forgetfulness. Another answer is that God wants our very being. God wants to reunite with us. God, the divine within us, wants to reunite with us. That is the goal of prayer, and that is the purpose of prayer. Prayer, we may pray about many things, but the purpose of prayer is to come back to God. Now, taking that down a notch from there, coming back to a more ordinary level that we can understand more easily, still, why does God not answer prayers that seem to be good, seem to be legitimate? The prayer for my child who is sick, the prayer for my own spiritual welfare and so forth, where I seem to be getting nowhere. Well, no, there also God hears our prayer. In a more ordinary sense also, God hears our prayer. God hears the prayer of a mother for her child, for her sick child, for her dying child. God hears that also. But God sees the entire total picture, and we only see a slice of life. We don't see the whole picture. We don't know what has gone before for many lifetimes and what is going to come afterwards in many lifetimes. But God sees the whole picture. And so it's said, and eventually we find it's true, that our prayers are answered when the time is right. Sometimes we find that our prayers are answered very quickly for something like a sick child or something. Suddenly the child becomes well and the doctors say that there's no hope. So sometimes the prayers are answered quickly. Other times they don't seem to be answered. But God has heard. God has heard. But God sees the larger picture. Perhaps from our standpoint we can't say, but we can imagine that perhaps God knows the journey of the child and knows that the child has had the experience that the child needed in this life. And now it's time for the child to move on. And maybe it's time for us to move on also. But we can't. We can't. And so that we have to learn to do. Now, I don't say that lightly. I don't say that, oh, well, your child died, just move on, forget about it. No, I don't mean that. I don't mean any heartless kind of advice. But yes, if we've lost a child, one of the most painful experiences that a person can have, losing their own child, then even that we have to learn to incorporate in the larger picture. Not to get over it, get a life, go on to something else. You can have more children, so forget about that one. No, nothing like that. But learn to incorporate that within the larger picture. In spiritual life, we have to learn to incorporate everything within the picture of life. Why is there someone like Hitler who killed so many people? Why is there someone like Stalin who killed and tortured so many people? Why are there other bad people in the world? No, our philosophy, our religion has to be big enough to contain all of that. If our religion can be destroyed, if our faith can be lost because of the existence of a Pol Pot or a Hitler or a Stalin or so many others, big and small tyrants and so forth, if our faith can be destroyed by the death of a loved one, then our faith is really very weak. Our faith is terribly weak. We have to have a faith which is large enough to contain the whole world, large enough to contain the whole universe. A faith which is big enough to know that in the midst of the greatest terror, God is present. God is there. You see, even in something like the concentration camps in Hitler's Germany, that even there were miraculous acts of faith of people who even in that situation found God, in terrible situations. And so our philosophy, our religion has to be big enough to accommodate even that. Not to say that it's good, not to wish for it, not to say, oh, it doesn't matter, it's all karma. No, not to be casual about it, but to realize that yes, even in the greatest destruction, there's the presence of the divine. And that if we could see the whole picture, then we would see how everything fits together. It's because we see a cross-section that everything looks disjointed and everything looks out of place. But that's only because of our picture of things. So Swami Vivekananda, when he was Narendra, he was trying to understand how it was that his parent, after his father died, how his mother and his brothers and his sisters could be suffering so much when they were good people. They were good people, his own loved ones, and they didn't have food to eat. Narendra himself would go without food for days, telling his family that, oh, I've already eaten at a friend's house, so that his mother wouldn't save something for him. He hadn't eaten at a friend's house because he was too proud to tell his friends that he was hungry. But he would go without his food so that his brothers and sisters and mother would have some more to eat. In those dire circumstances, he couldn't understand the cosmic situation, how such a thing could happen. And so then when he had that experience where he came to Sri Ramakrishna and asked him to pray to the Divine Mother that his mother and brothers and sisters would have food to eat. And Sri Ramakrishna sent him to the Divine Mother and said, no, you go to the mother and ask her yourself. You ask her yourself, why should I ask? It's because you ignore her that this is happening. You go and ask yourself. And so Narendra went to the Divine Mother, as you know, in the Kali temple. And when he got there, determined that he was going to ask for his mother and siblings, then he saw the living mother there. And then all he could ask for was knowledge and devotion. And then he came back to Sri Ramakrishna in an ecstatic state, and Sri Ramakrishna said, so did you ask? And only then he realized, oh my God, I forgot. No, I didn't ask. So again he went back. So 3 times he went, and each time the same thing. The 3rd time, finally he realized, he remembered to ask, and he said, how can I ask that of the Divine Mother? When he saw the reality of the Divine Mother. And so then Sri Ramakrishna blessed him and said that no, your family will have at least the minimum of food and clothing. But then after that, Swamiji or Narendra realized in that experience, he realized the whole picture. How it is that in the midst of the tragedies of life, that God is present and God's love is present. And it's through the ups and downs of life that we are wending our way towards God. We're wending our way towards God. As I said recently in another talk, if all problems were removed from our life, we would start inventing problems. Because that's how we live. Life is problem solving. That's all life is. Until we solve the final problem. The final problem is forgetfulness of the divine, or forgetfulness of the infinite self. That's the ultimate problem. But the little problems are there as we work our way along until ultimately we realize, oh, there's only one problem. Let me solve that, then all problems are solved. And so then we realize that, yes, without problems, life doesn't go on. I've seen very wealthy people, extremely wealthy people, people who had enough money so that they could buy their freedom from problems, buy their way out of problems, and they had handlers to take care of problems and everything. And then what do you see in their lives? I've seen it. You see in their lives that the smallest little thing becomes a huge problem. Smallest little. I once saw someone in Montecito, one of the wealthiest communities in America, where it just so happens that we have one of our convents. Extremely is where Oprah Winfrey and people much richer than Oprah live. And so a man came into the filling station where I was, and in Montecito they don't have any self-serve. Nobody's going to serve themselves. It's only white glove people who come out and put the gas in your car. And so there's a man who pulled up in his sparkling Rolls Royce, just shining for all it was worth, and a big Rolls Royce. He pulled up and so he got out and told the attendant, and he obviously was a good man. He wasn't somebody who was leading a dissipated life or anything. I mean, he's a good man, very wealthy, but a good man. And so he told the attendant, oh, could you please check my oil? I'm sure that the oil is just filthy. Oh, I need to get the oil changed. I'm sure, the oil is just probably so filthy. I could just imagine, because the car was so gleaming, the engine of the car when they raised the hood was gleaming spotless, so the oil might have been clear, but just a little bit of color, discoloration to it. And this was a huge thing. Oh, you've got to solve this problem for me. So if you don't have real problems, you invent problems. And I've seen other cases of that also. So life is problem solving. And so the solution to the problem of life is not to ask God to solve our little problems, but to pray for guidance, to pray for protection, to pray that my mind turn towards God, pray for blessings on others that we want to pray for. We can always pray for others. There's no harm in that. Pray for the welfare of others, and that helps. It does work. But it doesn't mean that we'll get what we want in terms of outcomes as far as ordinary things go. Like a son who is sick, very sick, and we want them to live. Yes, that's natural. And there's no harm in praying for the welfare of your son. But it may not work out. It may not work out. And that we have to be deep enough and big enough to sustain. We have to be big enough, and it doesn't mean that it won't hurt. Certainly it will hurt. It doesn't mean that we won't feel it. No, certainly we will. We would be inhuman if we didn't feel it. Swami Vivekananda said, we don't want to become like the wall. The wall doesn't feel anything. That's not what we want. We want to be feeling people, compassionate people, empathetic people. But things don't turn out the way that we want because we only see the small bit of the picture. We don't know what happens to our son after the son dies, after our daughter, after the daughter dies, after our mother dies, father dies, partner dies, whatever. We don't know. We don't see the bigger picture. We only feel the immediate loss. So that we have to recognize that, yes, I'm going to feel the immediate loss. It's going to hurt. But I have to be big enough to sustain that. I have to be big enough to sustain it. And to know through my regular practice that God does hear our prayer. God does hear our prayer. That God is not God if God doesn't hear our prayer. God does hear prayer. God listens to prayer. And God does answer prayer when the time is appropriate. When the time is appropriate. And again, it's not that God needs us to inform her of anything. It's that we need to pray in order to focus the mind on God, in order to pour the energy of our mind in prayer towards the divine. And our prayers for others also help. Again, not because God needs to be informed and God decided that because you prayed, therefore I'm going to help them. No, it's not like that. The fact of praying to God for a person is also sending beneficent energy to that person. Beneficent thoughts are powerful. And so our thoughts going to God are also going to the person. And so it's the power of prayer which is helping them. It's not that we're changing God's mind, that God was going to let them die or be sick. It's the fact that our good beneficent thoughts and energy are going towards God for this person, that it also goes towards the person and helps the person. And so, again, we shouldn't be so small that we think that because things don't turn out the way that I wanted them to, because all problems are not removed from my life. No, if all problems were removed from your life, then again you would start making up problems so that you could have them because you need them. We need them. We go through life thinking that after I solve this problem, I've got this problem facing me at work, I'm going to get rid of that, and then it's going to be smooth sailing. Oh no, by the time we've solved that problem, 3 other problems have already turned around the corner of life and are hitting us now. And that goes on throughout life, from birth to death. So life is not going to be problem-free. Life is solving problems until we solve the big problem. And in that also, prayer is a very effective tool. So I'll close here. And let me see if there's any one question. Otherwise, I'll give a closing chair. Yes, Deepa.
Everything that we spoke is about larger picture. That although your current prayer has not been answered, but there is a larger picture where it has been taken. But many times what we hear is that your prayer has not been answered because of your past karma. which you have never mentioned. So I was just saying, is there any relationship?
That's a good question, and I'm glad you brought it up. I didn't bring it up, and I intentionally didn't bring it up only because the question of karma is a complicated thing in itself that I would like to address it in one of my talks, but in answer, your question is a good one, and I will give an answer to that. But there's much more that can be said than I will say now. We often look on karma as a fixed thing, that karma is, I've done all of these things in the past, and that's why I'm experiencing the present. And yes, there's a great deal of truth to that. But as Holy Mother said, through the grace of God, the results of karma can be minimized. So she says that if you get a cut on your arm, then if a person who's very devoted to God gets a cut on their arm, perhaps without their prayer and devotion to God, they would have lost the arm itself. So the karma comes, but prayer has the ability to minimize the effects of karma. Devotion has the ability to minimize the effects of karma. Not, again, because God is partial. God is not sitting there thinking, oh, Deepak's praying to me, so I'm going to reduce his karma, but so-and-so is not praying to me, so I'm really going to give it to them. No, not like that. But because of, through prayer, through your devotion, you're connected to a larger reality. And that begins to reduce the power of karma. Because karma is active because of our ignorance. That's why an illumined soul has no karma. And as we go towards God, as we become devoted, as we try to move towards God the best that we can, then our ignorance is becoming minimized. The ego is becoming softened. And through that, the effects of karma also are becoming softened. And so karma can be softened. Yes, the results of karma still have to come. Like in Sri Ramakrishna's case, he had cancer of the throat. Why? He said that he took on himself the sins of devotees. Now maybe those sins were such, in the case of people like Girish and others, and many others, not just Girish, in the case of many others, maybe those were enough that would have led to numerous rebirths for such people and many painful situations they had to go through. But Sri Ramakrishna was able to absorb that and had the power to absorb it enough so that all of that mass of bad karma he took from so many people, that it manifested as cancer in his throat, which eventually he died from. But that's all that and it was exhausted there. We couldn't exhaust it that way. If we tried to take on such a thing, then we would destroy ourselves and before we even had exhausted a little bit of it. But Sri Ramakrishna, because of his great power, he was able to digest it like Shiva, drinking the poison and getting the blue in his throat. And so prayer does have the power to reduce karma, and a great soul, because of their union with God, they can reduce it to a small amount, the karma, even the karma of others that they take on to themselves. So it does benefit. So let me stop here. Oh, was there one, Mamata, did you raise your hand? No, okay. Yes, Suren.
About the prayer and the forgetfulness, Kabir wrote a couplet for ordinary people.
Who wrote a couplet?
Kabir.
Oh, Kabir, yes.
Yeah, for ordinary people, but it encompasses the whole thing, the prayer and the forgetfulness. दुख में सुमरन सब करें, सुख में करे न कोई, जो सुख में सुमरन करे, दुख काहे को होए. People remember God when they are desperate. But if they keep remembering God when the times are good, then hopefully the desperation will not come.
Yes. Yes, that's very good. And if we cultivate that power of remembering God, then even in the times of suffering, then that will still sustain us. Then we'll know that God is there even now. God is there even now. If we haven't cultivated that, and we try to cultivate it only when we're desperate, then of course we don't have the capacity to feel it. God is there even then, but we can't feel it, and we can't see it. So, okay, now let me give